You're not healing. You're just avoiding the real problem. You've been doing everything right, the morning routine, the workouts, the productivity systems, the boundaries, the journaling, maybe. The long stretches of keeping yourself busy enough that the difficult things don't get too much space to breathe. From the outside, and sometimes even from the inside, it looks like progress. It looks like someone who has done the work, made the changes, moved forward. But then something small happens. A message from the wrong person. A song from the wrong year. A comment delivered without malice that lands with a weight completely disproportionate to its size. And in the space of a few seconds, everything that looked stable reveals itself to still be sitting on an unsteady foundation. The reaction surprises you. It shouldn't, not after all this time, not after everything you've done to get past it. But there it is. The same tightness. The same familiar darkness. The same feeling you were certain you had already dealt with, resurfacing as though nothing had changed at all. Here is the question worth asking honestly, without the protection of a comfortable answer. Have you actually been healing? Or have you become extraordinarily skilled at not feeling certain things? Because those two experiences can look identical from the outside. They can feel similar from the inside for long stretches, right up until the moment they don't. Healing and avoidance both produce a kind of functional calm. Both allow a person to operate, to produce, to appear stable. The difference is not visible in the good days. It reveals itself in the moments of contact, when life, without warning, touches exactly the place that was never actually addressed. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, Book 5, paragraph 16, that the object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. He was speaking about the unconscious life, the life lived on reflex, on habit, on the accumulated weight of unexamined patterns. And in the language of modern psychology, what he was describing is precisely this. The person who has organized their entire existence around avoiding a specific internal experience is not living freely. They are living in permanent, sophisticated reaction to something they have never agreed to face. In this video, you are going to understand the difference between real emotional healing and psychological avoidance that has learned to wear the language of growth. Why certain emotions unfaced don't weaken with time. They deepen their hold on the decisions, relationships, and self-perception of the person carrying them. Why silence feels threatening to someone who has been using noise as medicine. Why the beginning of genuine healing almost never feels like relief. And what to do when you finally stop running long enough to discover what has been waiting in the stillness. This is not a comfortable video. But you already knew that, because comfort for a long time now has been exactly the problem. Distraction can look exactly like healing. There is a version of recovery that looks convincing from every angle. The person who went through something difficult and came out the other side more organized, more focused, more disciplined than before. They wake up earlier, they work harder, they fill their schedule with intention and their social media with evidence of forward motion. They talk about the experience in the past tense, with the measured tone of someone who has processed something and arrived somewhere better. And maybe they have, or maybe the schedule is doing something the processing never did. This is one of the most important distinctions in the entire territory of emotional health, and one of the least examined, because it requires questioning something that looks like progress. Productivity feels virtuous. Structure feels healthy. The ability to function after something painful feels like evidence of resilience. And all of those things can be exactly what they appear to be, or they can be something else entirely. A sophisticated, socially acceptable, internally convincing form of not dealing with what actually needs to be dealt with. The difference is rarely visible in the behavior itself. It lives in what the behavior is protecting against. Consider two people who have both been through a significant loss, a relationship ending, a betrayal, a failure that cost them something real. Both of them, in the months that follow, build better routines, exercise more consistently, invest in their work, spend time with people who are good for them. From the outside, they appear nearly identical in their recovery. But inside, something is different. One of them has done the emotional work that the new structure is supporting, has actually sat with the grief, allowed the full weight of it to arrive, processed the meaning of what happened, and integrated it into their understanding of themselves. The other has built the structure precisely to ensure that work never has to happen. The routine isn't supporting healing, it's replacing it. The second person isn't weaker. They aren't less intelligent or less capable. They are simply doing what the human mind does when confronted with pain that feels too large or too complicated to face directly. They build around it. They create enough forward motion that the thing at the center never quite gets the stillness it would need to surface. Marcus Aurelius returned to this theme with uncomfortable frequency throughout the Meditations. In Book 2, paragraph 13, he observed that a person has only a short time left to live, and yet they act as if they have an infinite supply of future moments in which the real work can be done. He was describing procrastination in its deepest form, not the avoidance of tasks, but the avoidance of the interior life, the habitual deferral of genuine self-examination in favor of the manageable surface of daily activity. You say you're better, but you still need to be constantly occupied to avoid feeling certain things. That sentence deserves to be held without immediate defense, because the need for constant occupation is one of the clearest available signals that something beneath the occupation has not been resolved. A person who has genuinely processed a painful experience can tolerate stillness. They can sit with an unscheduled afternoon without the discomfort escalating into something that needs to be immediately addressed through activity. The silence doesn't threaten them, because there is nothing in the silence that is still unresolved, waiting to surface the moment the noise drops away. But for the person who has been managing rather than healing, silence is a different kind of experience entirely. It isn't rest, it's exposure. The moment the distractions thin, something begins to emerge from underneath. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be easy to name, but unmistakably. A pressure, a weight, a reminder that the foundation isn't as solid as the structure built on top of it has been suggesting. The life looks more organized, but certain triggers still produce reactions that are completely disproportionate to what caused them. That disproportion is not a character flaw, it is information. Precise, reliable, honest information about where the actual work still needs to happen. And the first step toward doing that work is being willing to distinguish between the life that looks like healing and the interior that has been quietly waiting, with extraordinary patience, for the moment when the avoidance finally exhausts itself. Because the mind's methods of escape are more varied and more inventive than most people realize, and recognizing them is the beginning of something the distraction was always meant to prevent. The mind learns how to escape itself. The early forms of avoidance are usually obvious enough to name: drinking too much, sleeping too little or too much, withdrawing from people entirely, or filling every available hour with social activity that never quite reaches any real depth. These patterns tend to be visible to others and eventually to the person inside them, precisely because they carry the texture of someone not coping well. They look like what they are, but the mind is adaptive. And one of its most remarkable and most problematic adaptations is the ability to take the same underlying impulse and rewrote it through behaviors that carry no social stigma whatsoever, that are in fact actively celebrated, that produce genuine external results while leaving the interior problem entirely untouched. Hyperproductivity is perhaps the most effective of these. The person who responds to emotional pain by working harder, achieving more, filling their resume and their days with accomplishment. This person does not look like someone in avoidance. They look like someone who has channeled difficulty into motivation, and sometimes that's exactly what has happened. But sometimes the work is not a channel for processing. It is a substitute for it. The achievement is real, the output is real. The metrics of success accumulate with genuine momentum, and none of it touches the thing that started all of it. The same applies to extreme discipline, the rigid routine, the controlled diet, the optimized sleep, the carefully managed environment. These can be expressions of genuine self-respect and intentional living, or they can be expressions of something else, the need to maintain absolute control over the outer experience in order to prevent the inner one from becoming ungovernable. The discipline isn't building something, it's containing something, and the distinction from the inside can be almost impossible to feel because both produce the same sensation of having things under control. Carl Jung identified this mechanism with characteristic precision. He observed that the psyche, when it cannot eliminate an unbearable content, will construct an entire personality structure around avoiding it. Not a false personality, a real one, with genuine capabilities and genuine achievements, but one organized at its foundation around a specific interior avoidance. The persona that emerges is functional, often impressive, and deeply defended against the particular kind of introspection that would bring the avoided content into direct awareness. Some people turn their entire life into a permanent emotional waiting room. They are always almost ready to deal with it. After this project, after this season, after things settle down, after they get to a point of stability from which the harder examination feels less risky. And because the life is always full, because there is always another project, another season, another reason why now is not quite the right time, the examination never arrives. The waiting room fills with increasingly sophisticated justifications for why the door it leads to remains closed. The mind doesn't distinguish between healing and distraction if both temporarily reduce the pain. This is the mechanism that makes sophisticated avoidance so durable. The relief it provides is genuine. The distraction actually works, in the short term, within any given day, across stretches of weeks where functioning is maintained and the surface remains calm. The problem is entirely a long-term one. The relief is real, but it is not resolution. The calm is real, but it is not peace, and the difference between those pairs of things only becomes fully apparent in the moments when the distraction fails, when life delivers something the coping mechanism wasn't designed to handle, or when the sheer accumulation of avoided interior material reaches a volume that can no longer be contained by even the most carefully constructed outer life. Avoided emotions don't disappear. They wait for silence. And silence, for the person who has been running from themselves with sufficient consistency and skill, becomes something to be managed rather than welcomed. Something to be filled before it can fill itself with what was always there. The phone, the screen, the noise, the plans, the constant forward momentum, these aren't weaknesses. They are solutions, functional, temporary, progressively less effective solutions to a problem that only deepens the longer it goes unaddressed. Because there is a signal available that cuts through every layer of sophisticated avoidance. A signal that doesn't respond to discipline or achievement or carefully maintained routine. A signal that arrives without warning and reveals, in the space of a few seconds, exactly where the actual work still needs to happen. The trigger never lies. It arrives without warning and without proportionality. A specific tone of voice, a particular kind of silence from someone whose response you were waiting for. A scene in a film that shouldn't land the way it does. A memory triggered by something so small, a smell, a song, a phrase, that the intensity of the reaction seems almost absurd relative to its cause. For a moment, everything that had been stable becomes unstable. Everything that had been managed becomes unmanageable. And then, as quickly as it arrived, it recedes, leaving behind not resolution but the slightly unsettled feeling of something that has been glimpsed but not fully seen. Most people in that moment focus on the trigger. They analyze the external stimulus, the message, the comment, the person who said the thing. They examine whether the reaction was justified, whether they overreacted, whether the other person was at fault, and sometimes that examination is appropriate. But very often it is a misdirection, because the trigger didn't create what was felt. It revealed something that was already there, something that had been waiting below the surface of the managed life for a gap in the defenses through which it could briefly emerge. This is what emotional triggers actually are at their foundation. Not external provocations that produce emotions out of nowhere, but pressure points. Specific locations where unresolved emotional material lives waiting for contact. When something in the external environment makes contact with one of those locations, the response is automatic, involuntary, and entirely disproportionate to the present moment. Because it isn't primarily responding to the present moment. It is responding to everything that the present moment has activated. Every previous experience of the same emotional texture. Every earlier version of the same wound. You believed you had moved past it, until a single message, comment, or rejection changed your entire emotional state in seconds. The nervous system doesn't process time the way the rational mind does. The rational mind understands that the past is concluded, that the relationship ended, that the failure happened, that the loss was real and is over. But the nervous system stores experience as pattern rather than as narrative. It doesn't file events under dates and contexts. It files them under emotional signatures. And when the present moment produces a signature that matches something stored, the quality of a silence, the specific texture of being overlooked, the particular feeling of being found insufficient, the entire stored experience activates, not as a memory, as a present tense physiological event. Epictetus addressed the relationship between automatic response and conscious awareness in the Discourses, Book 2, Chapter 18, where he drew a sharp distinction between the initial impression, the automatic, involuntary first response, and the judgment that follows it. The impression, he argued, is not within immediate control. It arrives before choice can operate. But the relationship to the impression, what is done with it, whether it is examined or immediately acted upon, whether it is allowed to pass or amplified through subsequent interpretation, that is entirely within the domain of conscious agency. The trigger doesn't create the pain. It only reveals where it was already living. This reframe changes the nature of the information entirely. Because if the trigger is a revelation rather than a creation, then its content is valuable rather than merely disruptive. It is pointing, with precision, that no amount of deliberate introspection might have located, directly at the place where the real work still needs to happen. It is saying without ambiguity, here, not there, not in the external situation, not in the behavior of the person who delivered the stimulus. Here, in this specific location of your interior life, something has not been resolved. The person committed to avoidance will manage the trigger, will develop strategies for reducing exposure to the stimuli that activate it, will build a life carefully enough arranged that the pressure points are rarely contacted, and when they are, the recovery protocol is efficient enough to restore surface calm quickly. This can work, technically, for a significant period of time. The triggers become less frequent as the protective architecture becomes more sophisticated. But the wound beneath them doesn't close. It waits, and the energy required to maintain the architecture, to keep the life arranged in the specific configuration that minimizes contact with the unresolved interior, is energy that is permanently unavailable for anything else, anything more alive, anything that would require the kind of genuine vulnerability that avoidance was always designed to prevent. And what many people discover, after years of managing their triggers with increasing sophistication, is that the management itself has become a problem. That the effort to control emotional reactions externally has produced something internally that was never the intention. Self-control can become emotional suppression. There is a version of Stoicism that gets taught incorrectly, not always in formal settings, but in the way it filters through popular culture and self-improvement discourse. It presents itself as the philosophy of not being affected, of maintaining composure under all circumstances, of achieving a kind of emotional imperviousness that allows a person to move through difficulty without being visibly disturbed by it. And people who are drawn to this version of Stoicism are often people for whom emotional control feels like the most urgent need. People who have been hurt, who have felt out of control, who have decided that the solution to emotional pain is the elimination of emotional vulnerability. The philosophy becomes, in their hands, a sophisticated justification for something that predates their encounter with it. They were already suppressing. Stoicism gave the suppression a name that sounded like wisdom. This matters because the difference between genuine emotional maturity and emotional suppression is one of the most consequential distinctions in the entire territory of psychological health. And from the outside, they can look nearly identical. Both produce a person who doesn't visibly fall apart. Both produce composure under pressure, consistency of behavior, the appearance of someone who has their interior life well managed. The difference is entirely internal, and it is the difference between a person who has actually processed their emotional experience and a person who has learned to keep it at a distance so effectively that they have begun to lose access to it entirely. Genuine Stoic equanimity is not the absence of feeling. Every serious student of Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, or Seneca encounters this almost immediately. The Stoics were not advocating for emotional poverty. They were advocating for emotional freedom, for the ability to feel fully without being governed by what is felt, for the capacity to experience grief, anger, fear, and disappointment without those experiences becoming the organizing principle of every decision and relationship. Some people are not emotionally strong. They have simply lost the ability to feel fully. That sentence needs to be held without the immediate reflex to argue against it, because the reflex itself is often part of the pattern. The person who has been suppressing long enough develops a strong investment in the identity of emotional strength. They are the one who doesn't break down, the one who handles things, the one others bring their difficulties to because they appear to have found a way to exist above the turbulence that affects everyone else. And that identity, genuinely earned in many respects, becomes another layer of protection against the vulnerability that actual healing requires. Marcus Aurelius understood this temptation from within, which is what makes his writing on it so precise. In the Meditations, Book 7, paragraph 9, he wrote that the impediment to feeling is not the same as freedom from feeling, that the philosopher's task is not to become a stone, unaffected by human experience, but to retain full humanity while refusing to be enslaved by it. The Stoic ideal was never numbness, it was conscious presence. The ability to remain aware of what is being felt, to understand it clearly, and to respond from reason rather than from unexamined reaction without eliminating the feeling itself. Stoicism is not the absence of emotion, it is consciousness without emotional slavery. The person who suppresses in the name of strength has inverted this. They have eliminated the feeling in order to avoid the difficulty of responding to it wisely. And the elimination has costs that accumulate slowly, in ways that are easy to misread. The capacity for genuine intimacy diminishes, not because connection is unwanted, but because intimacy requires a kind of interior access that suppression systematically closes off. The ability to experience genuine joy becomes muted, not as a mood disorder, but as the natural consequence of a system that has learned to keep emotional intensity, in all its forms, below a certain threshold. The person becomes functional, stable, productive, and quietly, progressively, less alive than they were. The emotional system is not modular. It cannot selectively suppress pain while leaving the capacity for pleasure, connection, and aliveness fully intact. When the gates go up against what is unwanted, they go up against everything. The anesthetic doesn't target only the wound, it numbs the surrounding tissue as well. And the surrounding tissue, the capacity for genuine feeling in all its dimensions, is not something that can be easily recovered once it has been suppressed long enough. It requires a different kind of work than the work of building structure and discipline and control. It requires something that feels, to the person who has been suppressing, almost counterintuitive, almost dangerous. It requires turning toward the very thing the entire architecture was built to avoid. But before that turning becomes possible, something else needs to be understood. Something about why the pain that initiated all of this rarely has its roots in the event that appeared to cause it. The real problem is rarely the event. When something painful happens, a rejection, a failure, a loss, a betrayal, the mind naturally focuses on the event itself, on the specifics of what occurred, who was involved, what was said or done or withheld. This focus is understandable. The event is concrete. It has a timeline, a narrative, identifiable causes and identifiable consequences. It can be examined, discussed, analyzed, and that examination feels like the work of processing, like the direct engagement with difficulty that healing requires. But for many people, the event is not actually the source of the deepest pain. It is the occasion for it, the circumstance that activated something far older, far more established, far more central to the person's emotional architecture than the specific situation that triggered it. And treating the event as the primary problem, spending months or years processing the specific rejection, the specific failure, the specific relationship, addresses the surface while leaving the foundation entirely intact. Think about a reaction that seemed disproportionate to its cause. Not the mild overreaction that everyone experiences occasionally, but the kind where the intensity of the emotional response was genuinely puzzling, where even the person experiencing it could sense in some part of their awareness that something larger than the present situation was being activated. The relationship that ended but left devastation that seemed far greater than its actual duration or depth warranted. The criticism from a colleague that shouldn't have landed with anything like the weight it did. The moment of being overlooked in a group that produced a pain that felt briefly like something much older and more fundamental than the moment itself. These reactions are not overreactions in the sense of being irrational. They are precisely calibrated to a different situation than the one currently occurring. The nervous system, encountering the emotional signature of the present moment, is simultaneously responding to every previous experience that carried the same signature. The current rejection activates the earliest rejection. The current failure echoes the earliest experience of being found insufficient. The present moment of being overlooked resonates with something learned long ago about what happens when you are not seen. Sometimes what destroys you isn't what just happened. It's what it made you feel about yourself. Carl Jung described this layering as the complex, a cluster of emotionally charged associations organized around a core experience, usually formed early in life under conditions of emotional significance that operates largely outside conscious awareness. When the present moment activates the complex, the response is not to the present moment alone. It is to the entire accumulated weight of the complex, which is why a small stimulus can produce a response that seems wildly out of proportion to any reasonable observer, including the person experiencing it. This is why the same type of painful situation recurs across different relationships, different contexts, different periods of a person's life, not because of bad luck, not because of poor judgment in selecting situations or people, but because the underlying pattern, the emotional wound that each new situation is activating, has never been addressed at its actual level. The surface situations change, the emotional content they activate remains constant, and the person moves from one context to the next, carrying the same unresolved material, repeatedly encountering its reflection in circumstances that trigger the familiar response. Epictetus named this mechanism in the Discourses, Book 3, Chapter 3, when he observed that it is not events, but opinions about events that produce suffering, and that those opinions are often formed not in the present, but in the accumulated history of judgments made under conditions of pain. The opinion isn't, this rejection is painful. The opinion is, this rejection confirms something I have always suspected about my fundamental worth. And that second opinion, the one formed in early experience, carried forward without examination, applied automatically to every situation that carries its emotional signature, is the actual source of the sustained suffering. Treating the symptom without addressing the source produces a particular kind of futility that is deeply demoralizing over time. The person does everything right, processes the specific situation, draws the appropriate lessons, makes the appropriate adjustments, and then watches as the same emotional experience surfaces again in a different context. And the accumulation of those repetitions produces its own secondary suffering. The sense that something is fundamentally and unchangeably wrong, that healing is not actually possible, that this is simply the texture of their interior life, permanent and inescapable. It isn't, but reaching what actually needs to be reached requires something most people discover only after the cost of avoidance has become undeniable, because avoidance, maintained long enough and thoroughly enough, produces a consequence that most people notice only gradually, and by the time they notice it clearly, they have already lost something significant. Emotional avoidance slowly destroys aliveness. It begins so gradually that the change is almost impossible to pinpoint. There is no single moment where the decision is made, no clear before and after. Just a slow incremental narrowing of what is felt, of what is risked, of what is allowed to matter enough to potentially hurt. And because the narrowing happens in the direction of less pain, it registers at each individual step as reasonable, as self-protective. as the intelligent adjustment of someone who has learned from experience what exposure costs. But the adjustment doesn't stop at pain. It can't, because the emotional system that produces suffering is the same system that produces everything else. The capacity for genuine connection, for the particular pleasure of being fully present with another person, for the kind of joy that arrives not as entertainment but as aliveness. When the sensitivity is reduced in the direction of pain, it is reduced across the board. And what remains is a life that functions adequately, that produces and achieves and maintains relationships, but that feels from the inside strangely muted, like watching something through glass rather than being inside it. Many people who have been in sustained emotional avoidance for years describe this sensation, often without connecting it to the avoidance, as a kind of flatness. Things that should feel significant don't quite land with the weight they seem to carry for others. Celebrations feel somewhat hollow. Achievements produce a brief satisfaction that dissipates quickly, leaving the person searching for the next thing that might produce more. Relationships feel, at a certain depth, like performances, genuine enough on the surface, but not quite reaching something that would make them feel fully real. The person experiencing this often attributes it to external factors, to busyness, to stress, to not having found the right situation or person yet. They don't connect it to the interior strategy they have been employing for years, because the connection requires acknowledging that the same wall that kept the pain out has been keeping everything else slightly at a distance as well. The problem with emotional anesthesia is that it never removes only the pain. This is the paradox at the center of long-term avoidance, the thing that makes it ultimately self-defeating even on its own terms. The goal was to hurt less, and it works in the narrow sense of reducing the acute experience of specific painful emotions. But what it produces, over time, is a kind of chronic low-grade diminishment that is arguably more costly than the pain it was designed to prevent. Acute pain, faced directly, has a trajectory. It intensifies, it peaks, it metabolizes, it recedes. It leaves something behind: understanding, integration, the particular kind of strength that comes from having been through something and remained intact. Avoided pain doesn't follow this trajectory. It accumulates, it pressurizes, and it flattens the surrounding interior landscape in the process of being contained. Marcus Aurelius returned to the theme of full presence throughout the Meditations with a consistency that suggests he understood its difficulty personally. In Book 6, paragraph 2, he wrote that when you wake in the morning, tell yourself that the people you will deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly, and then go and engage with them fully anyway. Not from resignation, from the understanding that full engagement with the actual texture of life, including its difficulty, is the only alternative to a half-lived existence spent in management and avoidance. Who avoids feeling pain excessively ends up avoiding feeling life itself. The most dangerous aspect of this process is its invisibility. The narrowing doesn't announce itself. The person doesn't wake up one morning and notice that they feel less than they did 5 years ago. The change is too gradual, too incremental, too thoroughly integrated into the normal texture of daily experience to register as the significant loss it actually is. It is only in moments of contrast, a conversation that reaches unexpected depth, an experience that somehow breaks through the glass and lands fully, that the person briefly senses the difference between being present and being managed, between feeling and performing feeling. And those moments of contrast are not comfortable, because they reveal, with sudden clarity, the distance between where the person is and where they could be, between the life being lived and the life that would be available if the avoidance were released. That release doesn't happen through decision alone. It requires something the avoidance was specifically designed to prevent, the experience of genuine stillness. And in that stillness, something emerges that cannot be argued with, cannot be managed, and cannot be escaped through any amount of sophisticated distraction. Silence exposes what distraction hides. There is a specific kind of discomfort that has nothing to do with external circumstances. It arrives in the gaps, in the unscheduled afternoon, in the 10 minutes before sleep when the phone has finally been set down, in the quiet of an early morning before the day's demands have begun to fill the interior space. It is not sadness exactly, not anxiety in the conventional sense. It is something closer to pressure, a weight that rises from underneath the moment the noise drops away, as though it had been there all along, waiting patiently for exactly this thinning of the defenses. Most people respond to this discomfort by reaching for something: the phone, the next task, a conversation, a plan, a reason to move. And the reaching happens so automatically, so immediately, that it barely registers as a choice. It feels like a natural response to a moment that needed filling. But it is something more specific than that. It is the avoidance system doing precisely what it was designed to do, identifying the gap in the noise before the interior content can fully emerge, and closing it. You try to rest. But a few minutes of silence, and your mind is already searching for somewhere else to be. This pattern, the inability to tolerate genuine stillness, is one of the most reliable indicators that something beneath the surface remains unresolved. Because a person who has genuinely processed their significant emotional experiences doesn't experience silence as threatening, the quiet for them is simply quiet, restful, available. It doesn't carry the specific pressure of material waiting to emerge, because the material has already been met, felt, understood, and integrated. The interior is not full of things that require the noise to stay buried. But for the person who has been avoiding, however skillfully, however productively, however sophisticatedly, silence is a different kind of experience. It is the environment in which everything the distraction was containing becomes available for emergence. And that emergence, to a system trained toward avoidance, registers not as an opportunity, but as a threat, as something to be managed, shortened, interrupted, before it can develop into a full encounter with what is actually there. Seneca addressed this in Letters to Lucilius, letter 27. With his characteristic directness, he wrote that the person who finds one place intolerable finds all places intolerable, that the discomfort being fled is interior, not environmental, and therefore follows the person into every new location, every new situation, every new arrangement designed to outrun it. The silence is only intolerable because of what it contains. And what it contains doesn't change, because the external circumstances around it change. The beginning of healing often feels like emotional regression. This is perhaps the most important and least understood aspect of genuine psychological recovery, and the one most likely to cause people to turn back at precisely the moment they are closest to something real. When the avoidance system is finally, whether through choice or exhaustion or circumstance, given insufficient material to work with, when the distractions thin and the silence is allowed to remain for long enough, what emerges first is not relief. It is exactly what was being avoided: the grief, the anger, the shame, the specific, textured, fully dimensional version of the thing the avoidance was preventing from being felt. And this feels, to the person experiencing it, like things getting worse, like the healing that was supposed to be happening has reversed, like the stability that was carefully maintained is collapsing, and the entirely understandable response is to conclude that the stillness was a mistake. That engagement with the interior was destabilizing rather than healing, and to rebuild the protective architecture more carefully than before in order to prevent this from happening again. But what was actually happening was not regression, it was contact. The first genuine, unmediated contact with the actual emotional content of the experience, the contact that all of the prior activity, however valuable in other respects, had been successfully preventing. And contact, however uncomfortable, is the prerequisite for everything that follows. You cannot process what you cannot feel. You cannot integrate what you will not encounter. You cannot heal from a distance. Carl Jung wrote that what is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate, meaning that the interior content that is consistently avoided doesn't disappear from the person's life. It shapes it. It influences the decisions made, the relationships entered, the patterns that repeat across contexts and across years. It operates from beneath awareness with a consistency and a force that deliberate conscious intention rarely matches. The silence doesn't create the problem. It simply removes the conditions that were keeping it invisible. and invisible problems, however effectively concealed, have a way of making themselves felt through channels the person was not expecting and cannot easily control. Because the content that has been refused entry through the front door of conscious awareness will find another way in. And the longer it has been refused, the more forcefully it tends to arrive. Through reactions that seem inexplicable, through behaviors that contradict stated values, through the accumulated weight of what has been carried without acknowledgement for longer than was ever sustainable. What you consistently refuse to face begins to face you through everything else. What you refuse to face begins to control you. There is an idea that runs through the deepest thinking of both Stoic philosophy and modern psychology, stated differently in each tradition, but pointing toward the same precise truth. It is the observation that what remains outside of conscious awareness does not for that reason remain outside of influence. The unfaced interior content doesn't simply wait quietly in a sealed compartment while the rest of the person's life proceeds independently. It participates. It shapes. It intervenes in the reactions that emerge without permission, in the choices made without fully understanding why, in the patterns that persist across situations where every conscious intention was pointed in a completely different direction. The person who has been avoiding their emotional reality for years is not living freely. They are living in sophisticated, largely invisible reaction to the thing they have been avoiding. Every arrangement of the outer life, the schedule, the relationships, the carefully maintained distances, has been shaped in part by the requirement of not encountering what is being kept at bay. The freedom they believe they have achieved through control is not freedom at all. It is a more complex form of captivity, one that requires constant maintenance, constant management, constant vigilance to keep the avoided content from surfacing into awareness. What remains unconscious doesn't disappear. It manages your life from the background. Jung named this phenomenon with a precision that has not been improved upon. He wrote that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The person who repeatedly enters the same kind of relationship, despite full conscious awareness that the pattern is harmful, is not making a free choice. They are following an unconscious script that was written in early experience and has been running, largely unedited, through every subsequent situation that carries its emotional signature. The choice feels free from the inside. It is anything but. The same mechanism operates in every domain where significant emotional avoidance is present. The professional who sabotages themselves at exactly the moment success becomes fully available is not consciously choosing failure. They are following an unconscious belief about what they deserve, about what visibility costs, about what happens to people who are seen, that was installed long before the current situation existed. The person who withdraws from intimacy the moment it deepens beyond a certain threshold is not freely choosing distance. They are executing an avoidance protocol that was written in response to pain they never fully processed. Many people are not living consciously. They are reacting to wounds they never understood. This is a difficult observation to sit with, not because it is critical, but because it requires relinquishing a particular self-concept, the belief that one is, fundamentally, in conscious control of one's own choices, that the decisions being made are the product of deliberate intention rather than the accumulated weight of unexamined interior material, that the patterns, if they exist, can be addressed through better decision-making at the conscious level, through more careful choices, more disciplined behavior, more vigilant self-monitoring. But conscious decision-making operates on the surface. It works within the space that unconscious material has already defined, and the space it has defined, the range of choices that feel available, the options that feel safe, the relationships that feel possible, is shaped in significant part by what has not been faced, by the beliefs formed in early experience that were never examined, by the emotional wounds that were managed rather than met, by the interior content that has been, with considerable effort and ingenuity, kept just below the threshold of full awareness. Marcus Aurelius addressed the cost of unconscious living in the Meditations, Book 3, paragraph 16, where he wrote that the person who does not know what the world is does not know where they are, and the person who does not know their own purpose has no stable ground to stand on. He was describing the disorientation of the unexamined interior life, the way that genuine self-ignorance produces not freedom from the self, but captivity to it. The person who doesn't know what drives them is not exempt from being driven by it. They are simply unable to see the mechanism that is operating. Escaping that captivity doesn't require extraordinary willpower or dramatic transformation. It requires something quieter and more demanding than either. It requires the willingness to stop, consistently and honestly, running from what is there, and to turn, instead, toward it. Not with the intention of being overwhelmed by it, but with the understanding that what has been avoided is not actually more dangerous than the consequences of the avoidance itself. That turning is not easy. It produces something initially that feels exactly like what was feared. But it is in that precise encounter, in the direct, unmediated contact with what has been refused, that the control the avoided material has been exercising finally begins to loosen. And it is there, in that specific and uncomfortable place, that Stoicism reveals what it was always actually about. Stoicism is about confronting reality. At the center of every serious Stoic text, beneath the practical guidance about managing reactions, cultivating virtue, distinguishing what is within power from what is not, there is a demand that is rarely stated as directly as it deserves to be. It is not the demand for composure, not the demand for productivity or discipline, or the elimination of emotional excess. It is the demand for honesty, for the willingness to see what is actually there, in the world, in the situation, in the self, without the softening of comfortable interpretation, without the protection of strategic inattention, without the elaborate architecture of avoidance that the human mind constructs so naturally and so convincingly around what it finds difficult to face. The Stoics were not teaching people how to feel less. They were teaching people how to see more clearly. And seeing clearly, genuinely, unflinchingly clearly, requires turning toward exactly what the instinct toward comfort perpetually turns away from. Marcus Aurelius practiced this with a discipline that is remarkable even 2,000 years later. In the Meditations, Book 6, paragraph 13, he wrote that the first rule is to keep an untroubled spirit. The second is to look things in the face and know them for what they are. That sequence is not accidental. The untroubled spirit is not the prerequisite for honest seeing. It is the product of it. The equanimity that Stoicism cultivates is not achieved by avoiding difficult interior content. It is achieved by meeting that content directly, understanding it clearly, and discovering that it is survivable. That it does not, in fact, require the avoidance that has been consuming so much energy to maintain. Epictetus returned to this in the Enchiridion, chapter 33, with a directness that strips away every comfortable interpretation. He wrote that you should never say about anything that you have lost it, only that you have returned it. What is loved, what is built, what is felt, all of it arrives on loan, and the wise person meets this truth directly rather than constructing an emotional life organized around denying it. This is not cruelty. It is the specific form of honesty that produces genuine freedom, the freedom of a person who has looked at the actual nature of their situation and found that they can stand inside it without collapsing. Stoic discipline is not hiding pain. It is remaining present inside it without being destroyed. This distinction reframes everything that has been discussed in this video. The goal was never to become someone who doesn't feel. The goal was to become someone who feels fully, who allows the actual texture of experience, including its most difficult dimensions, to arrive completely, and who remains through that arrival intact. Not because the difficulty is denied, but because the person meeting it has developed, through practice and honest self-examination, enough interior stability to be present with what is real without being governed by the reaction it produces. That is the actual Stoic project. And it is almost precisely the opposite of what emotional avoidance produces. Avoidance seeks stability by keeping difficult content at a distance. Stoicism seeks stability by developing the interior capacity to meet difficult content directly. Avoidance requires constant maintenance, constant management of the outer environment to prevent contact with the inner one. Stoic practice, once genuinely established, requires something closer to release, the release of the elaborate management system, the willingness to encounter what is there, the discovery that genuine equanimity is not a condition that must be protected from reality, but one that is produced by honest engagement with it. The beginning of real healing almost never feels light. It feels like vulnerability. This is the point where many people who have been drawn to Stoicism as a framework for emotional control discover that they have been using it incorrectly, that what they found in it was permission to suppress rather than tools to confront. And making that correction requires a kind of honesty that the suppression was specifically designed to prevent. It requires acknowledging that the composure that felt like strength was in part a defense, that the discipline that felt like freedom was in part a constraint, that what was being avoided was not weakness, but the necessary passage through which genuine interior stability is reached. That passage is uncomfortable. It surfaces what was submerged. It makes temporarily visible what was kept invisible. It produces in its early stages the specific sensation of vulnerability that the entire management system was constructed to prevent. And it is in that specific, uncomfortable, unavoidable vulnerability that something the distraction could never produce finally becomes possible. Healing begins when escape ends. Nobody arrives at genuine healing through a decision made from comfort. That is the first thing worth understanding, and the thing most likely to be misunderstood, because the cultural conversation around healing tends to present it as something that happens when conditions are right, when the person is ready, when they have enough support, enough safety, enough distance from the original pain to engage with it from a position of stability. And while those conditions matter, they are not the threshold. The threshold is simpler and more demanding than any of them. The threshold is the moment when the cost of continuing to run exceeds the fear of stopping. For most people, that moment doesn't arrive as insight. It arrives as exhaustion, as the accumulation of a specific kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep, the tiredness of maintaining the distance, of keeping the structure intact, of ensuring through constant vigilance and constant occupation that the interior content that was never fully met never quite gets the conditions it would need to surface completely. That tiredness builds slowly, invisibly, over months and years, until one day the system that has been running the avoidance simply doesn't have enough remaining capacity to run it at the previous intensity. And in that gap, in the brief failure of the management system, something comes through. It doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It feels like falling, like the ground that was being carefully maintained has given way to something unstable beneath. But the instability that is felt in that moment is not new. It was always there, beneath the structure, beneath the routine, beneath the carefully maintained appearance of someone who has moved through difficulty and arrived somewhere more solid. What is new is simply the contact with it, the direct, unmediated experience of what was being carried without acknowledgement for longer than was ever sustainable. And that contact, however uncomfortable, however disorienting, however much it resembles what the entire avoidance system was designed to prevent, is where healing actually begins, not in the insight about the pattern, not in the understanding of why the avoidance developed, not even in the decision to engage differently with what is there. In the actual felt encounter with the actual emotional content, in the moment of genuine presence, with what has been refused presence for so long that its weight had become the invisible background condition of everything else. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in the Meditations, Book 4, Paragraph 3, that nowhere can a person find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in their own soul. He was not describing a soul that had been sealed off from its own difficult content. He was describing the specific peace that becomes available to a person who has met their own interior honestly, who has looked at what is there, including what is difficult, and found that they can exist inside that truth without requiring it to be different. That is not the peace of avoidance. It is the peace of genuine integration, of having carried something through to its actual completion rather than managing it indefinitely at a careful distance. You are not tired of the pain. You are tired of running from it. That sentence deserves to be examined slowly, because the fatigue that accumulates in long-term avoidance is often misattributed, assigned to external circumstances, to relationships, to the demands of a busy life, when its actual source is internal. The specific sustained effort of keeping the interior at bay, of ensuring the noise stays sufficient, of maintaining the outer structure in the precise configuration that prevents the inner one from suffecting. That effort is enormous. It runs continuously, below the level of conscious awareness, consuming energy that is then unavailable for everything else that matters. When the avoidance ends, not through force, but through the gradual exhaustion of the system maintaining it, or through the deliberate, practiced willingness to stop reaching for the distraction and allow the silence to remain, something unexpected happens. The pain that was being avoided does arrive, but it arrives differently than was feared. It arrives as experience rather than as catastrophe, as something that can be felt, that moves, that has a texture and a direction, rather than the formless, overwhelming threat that the avoidance system had been treating it as. Epictetus wrote, in the Discourses, Book 4, Chapter 7, that the person who is not afraid of death is not afraid of anything that might happen in life, because death is the ultimate form of the thing that cannot be controlled, and the person who has made genuine peace with that has released the deepest root of unnecessary suffering. Transposed into the emotional register, the person who is genuinely willing to feel the thing they have been most afraid to feel discovers that the fear of it was larger than the thing itself, that the avoidance was not proportionate to the actual danger, that what was being kept at such enormous cost was survivable, integrable, something that could be met and moved through rather than managed indefinitely. Some pains don't persist because they are too deep. They persist because they were never given genuine presence. This is not a comfortable realization, because it means that the healing that was unavailable, the resolution that felt impossible, the peace that remained just out of reach despite every effort, was not blocked by the severity of the wound. It was blocked by the refusal to fully encounter it. By the strategy, however understandable in its origin, of keeping just enough distance between the person and their own interior to prevent the full contact that integration requires. And releasing that strategy, choosing, repeatedly and against every conditioned reflex, to remain present in the silence rather than reaching for the noise, is not a single dramatic act. It is a practice, imperfect, non-linear, unglamorous in its daily execution, but cumulative in its effect. Building gradually the interior capacity that the avoidance was preventing from developing, the capacity to be present with what is real, to feel what is there, and to remain through that feeling fundamentally intact. That capacity is not the destination of healing. It is the condition under which healing becomes possible. And once it is present, once the person has discovered through direct experience rather than through intellectual understanding that the thing they were running from is survivable, everything that follows is different, not easier necessarily, not free from pain, but genuinely irreversibly different, because the person who has stopped running is no longer spending their life in reaction to what they are avoiding. They are, for perhaps the first time, simply here, in their actual life, present to what is actually available. No longer organized around the management of an interior, they refuse to inhabit fully. And in that presence, unremarkable, quiet, entirely their own, something becomes available that no amount of distraction, productivity, or sophisticated avoidance ever could have produced. Conclusion: everything this video has explored points toward a single realization that is genuinely difficult to absorb. Not because it is complicated, but because absorbing it requires relinquishing something that has felt, for a long time, like protection. The avoidance that looked like healing. The distraction that felt like forward motion. The control that masqueraded as peace. All of it was real in its way, real in the temporary relief it provided, real in the external results it produced, real in the identity it helped maintain. But none of it was healing. And the difference between what it was and what it appeared to be has been costing something significant. The Stoics did not promise a life without difficulty. They promised something more useful, a self capable of meeting difficulty without being destroyed by it, not because the difficulty is diminished, but because the interior that meets it has been developed through honest, sustained engagement with what is real. through the willingness to feel what is there, to face what has been avoided, to remain present inside what is difficult long enough for understanding, and then integration, and then, not quickly, not linearly, but genuinely, something that deserves to be called healing. Marcus Aurelius understood that this work is daily. In the Meditations, Book 2, Paragraph 1, he wrote that when you wake each morning, tell yourself that today you will meet difficulty, and choose to meet it with full awareness rather than with the reflexes of avoidance, not as pessimism, as preparation, as the ongoing commitment of a person who has decided that conscious engagement with reality, however demanding, is preferable to the elaborate and exhausting management of it from a careful distance. That commitment doesn't require perfection. It doesn't require the immediate elimination of every avoidance pattern that has accumulated over years. It requires something more modest and more sustainable, the willingness, in small moments and large ones, to choose contact over distance, stillness over noise, the interior over the endless occupation of the exterior, to reach slightly less quickly for the distraction, to remain slightly longer in the silence, to allow, gradually and imperfectly, more of what is actually there to be actually felt. Carl Jung observed that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Terrifying not because what is found inside is monstrous, but because full self-acceptance requires releasing the distance between the person and their own experience, requires inhabiting the interior rather than managing it from outside, requires the specific vulnerability of being fully present with what is real about oneself, without the softening of the distance that avoidance provides. And that vulnerability, which feels, at first approach, like exactly what the entire management system was designed to prevent, is not the enemy of stability. It is its source, the genuine, durable, internally generated stability that the avoidance was attempting to produce through external means. The peace that does not require the noise to remain in place, the presence that does not depend on constant occupation to feel tolerable. You were not broken by what happened to you. You were shaped by how you responded to it. And the response, however understandable, however adaptive in its original context, can be examined, understood, and changed, not through better management of the outer life, through more honest engagement with the inner one. Perhaps you are not tired of the pain. Perhaps you are tired of everything required to keep it at a distance, and when the escaping finally stops, when the silence is allowed to arrive and remain, and what surfaces in it is met rather than fled, you may discover that what was being carried was never as heavy as the effort of avoiding it, that the interior you were protecting yourself from is habitable, that the self waiting in the stillness is not something to be feared. It is simply you, fully present, finally home.